The river remembers everything, even the nights when the world grows silent enough to hear its heartbeat. When the Mississippi held its breath, the night settled over the water like a velvet curtain drawn by an unseen hand. The sky above was a deep, endless blue, the kind that made the stars look like old lanterns still burning from a time long gone. The river moved slowly, almost shyly, as though it feared to disturb whatever mystery was waiting upstream. It was on such a night quiet, cool, and unusually watchful that the drifting riverboat first appeared, gliding down the Mississippi without a sound. No paddlewheel churned the water, no coal smoke rose from its stacks, and no lantern swung from its railings. It came forward like a memory the river had decided to return to the world. The townsfolk of Willow Bend were the first to notice it. Willow Bend was a place where life passed gently, its wooden docks worn smooth by decades of fishermen, ferrymen, and river traders. Children grew up listening to stories of old riverboats that once carried fortunes and heartbreak along the mighty Mississippi. But even the oldest rivermen had never seen a boat like this. One, the way it drifted, the way it refused to obey the current, and the way it stayed perfectly centered in the moonlit water. Some said it looked abandoned. Others whispered that it looked expectant, as though waiting for someone brave enough to step aboard. Old Thomas Fletcher, the town's unofficial river watcher, stood on the dock with his lantern held high, squinting at the silhouette that floated closer. In his youth, Thomas had piloted riverboats up and down the Mississippi, learning every bend and whirlpool as intimately as the lines on his hands. He knew the river could be temperamental, unpredictable, ebb and bend a fool, but never silent. Yet tonight, it almost felt as if the Mississippi was holding its breath, waiting with them. The riverboat's hull caught the glow of his lantern, revealing chipped paint, rusted rails, and a name barely readable on the bow. The Nightingale. Thomas's voice came out in a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might break whatever spell the night had woven. "She hasn't sailed these waters in 50 years, he murmured, his breath fogging the cold air. "Not since the night she disappeared." The people gathered behind him murmured, unsure whether to be afraid or amazed. They all knew the story everyone along this stretch of the Mississippi did. The Nightingale had set off one late autumn evening in 1872, carrying a crew of 12 and a cargo of timber and mail. She had been a proud boat then, strong and steady, with a captain known for his fearless mastery of the river's moods. But before dawn, she vanished. No wreckage was found, no bodies recovered, no sign of struggle ever surfaced. The river had simply taken her, and that was the end of it. Until now. The Nightingale drifted closer, its wooden sides groaning softly like old bones adjusting to movement after decades of stillness. Something about the sound sent chills across the dock. The lantern light flickered across the deck, revealing dark windows and ropes hanging loosely like forgotten threads. There was no sign of life, no footsteps, no voices, not even the creak of a man keeping watch. A young girl named Eliza stepped forward, her eyes wide with a rather than fear. She tugged on Thomas's sleeve. "Sir?" she asked softly. "Is someone inside?" Thomas shook his head. "If there is, Chalil, they ain't got breath enough to show it." Still, the boat didn't look menacing. It looked lonely, like a traveler who had wandered too far for too long and finally found its way back home. The Mississippi's surface barely rippled as the riverboat reached the dock. It came to a stop as gently as a sigh, brushing against the wooden posts with the softest touch, as though it had been guided by an invisible hand. Thomas stepped forward, lantern raised, and placed a cautious hand on the railing. The wood felt cold, far colder than the night air around them. It was as if the riverboat carried with it the chill of forgotten places. He hesitated, then climbed aboard. The crowd held their breath as he disappeared into the dimness. Inside, the boat seemed frozen in time. Tables still held plates arranged neatly, though dust coated every surface like a fine gray shroud. Jackets hung on hooks near the cabin doors, untouched for years. A chessboard sat mid-game. The next move forever paused. Thomas moved slowly, his lantern casting long shadows that stretched and curled along the walls. It felt as though he were intruding on something sacred, something the river had kept hidden for half a century. He walked toward the captain's quarters, each step echoing in the hollow silence. The door creaked open to reveal an empty room. A journal lay open on the desk, its ink faded but still legible. Thomas leaned closer, squinting. The last entry was dated the night the nightingale disappeared. The words were shaky, hurried, written by a hand that had clearly known fear. The river is changing. The current is wrong. I hear something below deck. Something moving. This isn't the Mississippi I know. Thomas closed the journal, his heartbeat quickening. He sensed something not dangerous, but heavy with meaning. A secret long kept. A story half told. He made his way back to the deck, where the townspeople waited anxiously for any sign of his return. When he stepped off the boat, Thomas found himself unable to speak for a moment. The river was still unnaturally quiet, reflecting the moonlight like polished silver. Finally, he lifted his lantern and addressed the crowd. She came back, aside simply, but whatever happened out there, it wasn't meant to stay buried forever. The people of Willow Bend watched as the riverboat sat motionless against the dock, its silent presence filling the night with questions none of them could answer. The Mississippi seemed to exhale then, the surface rippling gently once more, as though satisfied that the forgotten vessel had finally found its way home. That night, long after the crowd had dispersed, Thomas stood alone by the water's edge. The wind stirred softly, carrying the scent of river silt and old stories. He understood now that the river never truly lost anything. It simply waited for the right moment to return what mattered. And on that quiet, breathless night, the Mississippi had chosen to remember. The night had not yet shaken off the chill of the river's secrets, and the air still hummed with the mystery the nightingale had carried home. Echoes of lantern light on forgotten waters drifted across the Mississippi like whispers returning from another lifetime. After the riverboat esa su then reappearance, Willow Bend did not sleep. His lamps stayed burning late in kitchen windows. Dogs barked without reason, and people spoke in gentle murmurs as if the river might be listening. The nightingale had come without a captain, without a crew, and without a single explanation, but the river brought her back with lanterns still hanging, faintly glowing, as though some unseen hand had tended them during the long years of her absence. Thomas Fletcher returned to the dock before dawn, the way a man returns to a question he can't let go of. The fog clung low over the water, curling around the boat's hull like pale fingers. Yet something about the river felt strangely calmer than the night before. The Mississippi flowed with steady purpose, almost protective, as if guiding the boat now that she had surfaced from memory into the waking world. Thomas noticed something he hadn't seen before: 3 lanterns hanging on the bow, their soft amber light flickering gently against the morning mist. He knew he hadn't lit them. No one had, and yet they glowed not bright, but alive, casting warm reflections that shimmered across the rippling water. They didn't behave like ordinary lights. They pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like the steady breathing of a sleeping child. Elisa, the girl from the night before, appeared beside him, her small hand warming his weathered fingers. "It's like the river is carrying its own stars," she whispered. Thomas nodded. Toge didn't fully understand it himself. The lanterns reflected across the Mississippi in long, glowing ribbons, moving not with the current but with the slow glide of the boat itself. The nightingale drifted, though not away from the dock rather. She shifted gently to align herself with the wide bend of the river, as if pointing toward some unseen path. The longer Thomas and Eliza watched, the more the lantern reflections began to resemble something else: shapes, patterns, almost like trails guiding the boat's movement. The Mississippi was a highway of stories, and these lantern lights seemed to be the river's way of remembering them. Thomas felt the pull of the river deep in his bones. He'd spent a lifetime reading water, listening to its moods, knowing when it lied and when it told the truth. This, whatever it was, did not feel like danger. It felt like a summons. The lantern light shimmered with the memory of that first breathless night, urging Thomas to look closer, deeper, past the surface of things. The townspeople slowly gathered again at the dock, drawn by the glow of the lanterns. Among them was Martha Hawley, Willow Bend's oldest resident, a woman whose eyes held more Mississippi stories than any journal ever written. She leaned heavily on her cane, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "I've seen that before," she said quietly. Thomas turned to her. When? Martha's gaze never left the drifting reflections. "A long time ago. Primera wa ese girl, no older than Eliza here. It was the night the nightingale first vanished. My father said he saw lantern lights on the river long after the boat should have passed. Lights moving without sound, without crew. He said the river was trying to tell us something." Elisa looked up at Martha. "What was it trying to tell?" "That the river remembers everything," Martha replied softly. "Even the things people try to forget." A hush settled over the crowd. The lanterns flickered gently, throwing warm light across Martha's face. She looked fragile, but the river's glow made her seem timeless. Thomas stepped onto the deck once more. This time, the wood felt different, less cold, more alive. As he walked the length of the ship, the lanterns cast shifting reflections across the planks, creating the illusion of ripples flowing under his feet. He reached for the nearest lantern, hesitating before touching it. The moment his fingers brushed the cool metal, a faint vibration spread through the railing, like a memory waking up. He tightened his grip. The lantern flame pulsed once. Then the riverboat moved, not forward, not backward, but gently sideways, as though adjusting itself to the river's whisper. The crowd gasped, but the movement was calm, controlled, almost purposeful. The nightingale was responding to something unseen, something deep beneath the surface of the Mississippi. Thomas steadied himself. "She's not drifting anymore," he murmured. "She's listening." The lantern glow deepened, echoing the same quiet urgency that had pulled the riverboat back home. Night fell again, and the Mississippi turned to liquid obsidian beneath a sky full of cold, bright stars. The three lanterns shone more boldly in the darkness, their reflections stretching across the river like pathways leading into forgotten places. The boat, though tied securely to the dock, continued to shift ever so slightly, as if tracing these paths in its memory. Thomas returned to the captain's quarters. The journals still lay there, open to its final entry. But now, beside the old ink, faint new marks appeared, water stains shaped like tiny droplets, arranged almost in a pattern. He touched them gently. They were fresh. Elisa called from the deck. "Mr. Thomas, look!" He rushed out to see what she meant. The lantern reflections now moved in slow, graceful arcs, forming a winding trail on the water. It looked like the shape of an old river route, one long abandoned, one swallowed by time and shifting currents, a route few remembered, and fewer still believed truly existed. Martha Hawley stepped forward again, her eyes widening with recognition. "That path," she whispered. "It's the one Captain Alden used to speak of. The hidden curve, where the river changes its voice. They said no one could navigate it without listening to the Mississippi itself." Thomas's breath caught. Captain Alden, the man who had vanished with the nightingale, had spoken of such things only in quiet moments, long before the night the boat disappeared. "Why would the river show us this now?" he asked softly. Martha answered with a heaviness that settled into the air like fog. "Because whatever took the nightingale may still be out there." A chill ran through Thomas, not of fear, but of awe. The lantern lights quivered like old memories resurfacing, guiding the living toward what the river had never forgotten. The Mississippi flowed faster now, its once quiet surface stirring with purpose. The lantern reflections brightened, illuminating the forgotten river path with ghostly clarity. The nightingale groaned softly, its timbers shifting in anticipation. Thomas understood then what the river was asking. It wanted him to follow, or perhaps it wanted to finish a journey left undone for 50 years. He placed his hand on the railing once more, steadying himself as the boat strained gently against its moorings. The lantern glow traveled across the water, calm but insistent, like a whisper calling through the night. Behind him, Eliza spoke in a trembling voice filled with wonder. The river wants us to remember. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the truth settle into him. The Mississippi was not simply a river, it was a keeper of stories, a guide for restless souls, and a witness to every echo of lantern light that had ever danced upon its surface. And tonight, it was ready to speak again. The river's whispers grew heavier through the night, carrying the weight of unanswered questions that pressed against every quiet heartbeat in Willow. Benda, the crew who vanished before dawn, had long been a tale, spoken in hushed tones along the Mississippi's bending shores. But now, after the nightingale's eerie return, the story seemed to breathe again. The lantern lights still flickered on the water, forming paths only the river understood. But the townsfolk knew that before anyone could follow those shimmering trails, they had to face the truth buried in the vessel's past. Thomas Fletcher stood on the deck of the Nightingale, the old boards groaning under his boots. The cool morning fog twisted around him, reminding him of the night 50 years ago when the boat and its 12 crewmen disappeared without a trace. The Mississippi was powerful, unpredictable, and often unforgiving, but it rarely took without giving something back. Yet for half a century, the river had kept silent about the Nightingale's fate. Until now, the lantern's glow still trembled across the water, as if urging the town to remember the night that history tried to forget. A small group gathered near the dock as the sun rose. Martha Halley with her cane, Eliza wrapped in a wool shawl too big for her, and several townspeople who had grown up hearing the old stories. Among them was Jonah Briggs, the grandson of one of the Nightingale's lost crewmen. He blackened his pipe with trembling hands, staring at the riverboat as though it might open a door to the past. "My grandfather, Jonas Briggs, was a deckhand," Jonah murmured. "He was strong, kind. Not the type to run from trouble, but if you believe the old tales, something frightened those men badly enough to leave no trace." "I remember the sound the river made. It wasn't right." She paused, looking at Thomas. "You hear anything strange inside the boat?" Thomas hesitated, thinking of the strange vibrations felt through the railing the previous night. Another, Daniel Price, claimed the river suddenly felt heavier, as though the boat was pushing against something invisible. And Captain Alden, usually silent and steady, paced the deck, muttering that the current had shifted in a way he had never felt in all his years on the river. Some said the crew saw shapes moving beneath the water, dark forms that drifted alongside for a time, disappearing when lantern light came near. Others whispered that the river began to glow faintly, as if illuminated from below. Dust lay across the floors like gray snow, but beneath it, faint scuff marks footprints, perhaps remained frozen in time. He knelt, touching the old tracks. 12 men had walked these planks, 12 men who had vanished into the river's silence. He moved toward the cargo hold. The air there felt heavier, colder. The wooden crates were intact, untouched, and yet something about the space whispered of movement, like echoes of footsteps that had never fully faded. Not from tools, not from animals, from hands. He swallowed hard and traced the patterns lightly. They formed no words, only jagged marks carved in desperation. Whoever scratched them had been afraid. Whoever tried to claw their way out had been trapped inside this very hold. He stepped back, heart pounding. Something terrible had happened here. He heard the deck creak above him, Eliza's footsteps. "Mr. Thomas," she called softly. "You found something." He climbed back up, meeting her bright but worried eyes. "Not something good," he admitted, "but something true." The lantern lights on the river brightened at that moment, as if in agreement. The Mississippi-esque glow stretched across the deck like a quiet reminder that truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deeply it sinks. Back on shore, Martha began to speak again. "There was one more thing," she whispered. Something the river never made again after that night. If my grandfather disappeared, maybe the river wanted to keep him. Eliza frowned slightly. But why? The river brought the boat back. Nah. Maybe because it's ready to finish the story. And he felt it again, that sense of quiet urgency, of the river calling them towards something long buried. The lanterns pulsed, slow and steady, like a heartbeat echoing beneath the water. The boat creaked as if stretching after a long sleep. The river still carried the weight of unanswered voices, and every ripple felt like the echo of a story waiting to be told. Whispers from the river pilot's old records began resurfacing in Willow Bend. As the Nightingale's mystery deepened, with the crew's disappearance still heavy in the air and the lantern lights shimmering across the Mississippi in strange, deliberate patterns, Thomas Fletcher knew the next piece of truth lay not in the living but in what the old river pilots had left behind. For generations, these men had kept journals filled with notes, warnings, and quiet confessions about the river's unpredictable moods. Some were practical, some were poetic, and some were so unsettling that families locked them away, hoping the Mississippi would forget. It never did. The weight of vanished footsteps still lingered on the Nightingale's deck, guiding Thomas toward the deeper history buried in ink and river silt. The morning after Thomas discovered the claw marks below deck, he walked to Willow Bend's small-town Arkiva brick building older than most of the houses. Dusty sunlight slipped through tall windows as townspeople gathered inside, searching through forgotten drawers, chests, and weathered ledgers. It was Jonah Briggs who brought out the heavy iron lockbox from the back room, its edges rusted, its hinges stiff. "These belonged to the river pilots," Jonah said, men who guided boats along the Mississippi before steam engines and modern charts. They wrote everything down, even the things they weren't supposed to speak of. Thomas opened the box. Inside lay journals, bound in cracked leather, folded river charts, and several loose sheets covered in hurried handwriting. Every page smelled faintly of river water, as if the Mississippi had seeped into the very ink. Elisa stood close by, watching with wide, steady eyes. Thomas picked up the first journal. The script was old-fashioned, angular, written by a hand used to the constant rocking of the river. Eredalud, the water at Mile Bend. 47 moves against the wind, like something alive. The lantern on my bow dimmed without reason. I heard knocking from beneath, though the boat rode shallow. I dare not stay long. Eliza shivered. Did he write what was knocking? Thomas turned the page. Not clearly, but he said he never took passengers through that bend again. Martha Halla stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. Let me see that. She studied the page, then nodded grimly. My grandfather spoke of that bend. He called it the river's hollow, said it was where the Mississippi swallowed voices. Jonah pulled out another journal, this one thicker, with a brass clasp still intact. Inside were the writings of a pilot named Edwin Corwin, a man known for his precision and fearless navigation. Yet even he wrote with uncertainty when it came to this stretch of water. There is a fog that clings unnaturally to the river in the late hours. It does not roll in from the banks. It rises from below. Lantern light barely reaches through it, and sound refuses to carry. I have heard men shouting from the fog when no boat was near. Thomas paused, feeling the words sink into him like cold water. Shouting from the fog. Voices without boats. Men lost without a trace. The old journals breathed with the same eerie hush that had settled over the river, weaving past and present into a single, trembling truth. Eliza found a small leather-bound booklet, buried beneath folded charts. She opened it carefully and gasped softly. Mr. Thomas. This one has Captain Alden's name. Thomas took it gently, the leather warm from Eliza's hands. The handwriting was smoother here, confident, with the controlled strokes of a seasoned pilot. The first entries were routine weather notes, water depth, cargo lists. But the last few pages darkened with unease. Something follows us at night. I cannot see it, but I feel it beneath the hull. The current changes without cause. The crew hears knocking, scraping, as if something is trying to break through. Another line. The lantern near the stern went out 3 times last night. Each time, the flame died suddenly as though smothered by wet hands. Eliza covered her mouth. Even Martha looked shaken, Thomas read on. Silas Reed reported murmurs below the deck. I checked it myself. Nothing but timber. Yet the air feels wrong. Heavy, as if thick with voices we cannot hear. Another entry. The ink jacket rushed. We sailed over the river's hollow tonight. The crew sensed it immediately, the water pulling downward. I ordered more steam, but the boat resisted. Something holds us. Then the final line barely legible. If the river takes us, may it remember our names. Thomas closed the journal slowly, the lantern light outside reflecting in his damp eyes. The story of the crew was no longer rumor or legend. It was written fact-etched in the trembling handwriting of a captain who had known the river better than anyone. The echo of Captain Alden's final words hung in the room, binding past and present with the same cold thread of fear and awe. Jonas spread several river charts across the table. The inked lines showed shifting currents, whirlpools, sunken logs, and safe passages. But on one chateau, most invisible someone, had drawn a faint circle around a deep curve, labeled 47 Hollow. That's the place, Jonah murmured. The same one the journals warn about. Martha tapped the chart with her cane. The Rivera pilots knew that place was wrong. Te Hustadin, T know why. Eliza's voice trembled as she asked, "Do you think the crew is still there?" "Somewhere under the river." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He looked back at the captain's journal, at the claw marks below deck, at the lantern lights dancing strangely across the water the night before. "I think," he finally said, "the river didn't keep the crew. It kept their voices, their fear, their final moments, and now it's returning them to us." Outside, the Mississippi stirred as if acknowledging his words. The lantern lights along the Nightingale flickered once, twice like a coded message. The river was waking up memories long buried, and not gently. The journal's warnings mingled with the whispering water, guiding Thomas toward the truth the river had guarded for over 50 years. As the townspeople filed out of the archive, Thomas remained behind, studying the journals again. There were more entries, dozens each one, echoing a story similar to the next. Lights dimming without reason, knocking when no hands should reach, fog rising from beneath the water, voices calling through empty night. One pilot wrote of seeing a hull in the fog, drifting silently, though no such vessel was recorded on the river that night. Another wrote of hearing his own name called from beneath the deck when he was alone. These were not isolated incidents. This stretch of river had always been strange. A hush lingered over the water, carrying the same uneasy calm that had settled after the river pilot's old records were uncovered. The night the drifting riverboat slid past the town of Willow Bend, the people felt something shift in the air, something older than their memories, softer than the breeze, and deeper than the Mississippi itself. Whisper Creek, the narrow bend of the river that curved around their settlement, had always carried stories. But never before had the river spoken with such a deliberate, unsettling quiet. The lanterns on the riverboat glowed faintly against the black water, and the townsfolk watched from porches, docks, and windows as if witnessing a message gliding in from another century. No one knew what the message was, but every heart felt its weight. The river had always been their neighbor, sometimes generous, sometimes unpredictable, but never silent. That silence frightened them more than any storm. The boat made no sound, not even the groaning of old wood as it moved. and the people could not shake the feeling that the river was holding its breaths just as surely as they were. The sky was low, the clouds dimming the moon, and yet the lanterns on the boat seemed to hold a steady glow that did not flicker. Even the frogs and night insects quieted as though leaning in to listen. Old Mrs. Darrow, the town's oldest resident and the local keeper of folk stories, stepped out with a kerosene lamp and stood at the water's edge. Her face, lined by 90 years of river winds and sun, turned toward the drifting silhouette. "That's no ordinary craft," she murmured, and those standing closest to her felt a chill crawl along their arms. She had known the river all her life, had listened to its rhythms, its tempers, its rare moments of gentle affection. For her to sound uncertain was enough to rattle even the bravest men. Some whispered that the riverboat was a remnant from the vanished crew whose story had been passed down for generations. Others said it was the same mysterious vessel the old river pilots had written about in their journals, the one that always appeared on moonless nights and always slipped away before dawn. And a few, especially the younger men, insisted it had to be a prank or an abandoned vessel drifting downstream. But the moment they looked into the lantern-lit windows and saw no movement, no figures, no shadows inside, their bravado dissolved. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts, dogs whimpered and curled their tails. The riverboat made its way past the town with unbroken grace, steady as breath, gentle as a drifting memory. Nobody attempted to board it. No one even called out. Only one person dared to raise his voice: Samuel Pike, the town's ferry operator, who cupped his hands and called. "Who's aboard?" His shout echoed across the water, bouncing between the dark bluffs on both sides of the river. No answer returned. The lanterns glowed, the windows remained empty, and the boat drifted onward. Even Samuel, bold in most matters, felt the hairs rise on his neck as the boat slipped farther into the curve of the river and the last lantern-esque glow dissolved into the night. The townspeople slowly gathered closer together, unsure of what they had just witnessed. For a long moment, no one spoke. The river resumed its usual voice. The frogs began to croak again, and the night insects resumed their rhythms, as though nature itself had exhaled. Reverend Claiborne, the town preacher, finally broke the silence. "The river has always carried messages," he said, his voice low, "but sometimes those messages are warnings." His words rippled through the crowd like a shift in the current. The people exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded, some shook their heads. But everyone felt it, the sense that the riverboat was not a simple passing sight, but a sign of something stirring beneath the surface of their familiar world. The next morning, the town gathered in the small meeting hall near the docks. It had once been a trading post, back when the river was the main way goods flowed through the region, and it still smelled faintly of timber and tobacco. The conversation swirled around the drifting vessel. Theories varied wildly. Some insisted it was a ghost ship, others that it was crewed by restless spirits of river workers from decades past, and still others believed someone, somewhere, wanted to send a message to Willow Bend specifically. Sheriff Horace Brandt, a man known for his calm and steady reasoning, dawned. "Folks," he said, "before we jump to stories, let's remember what we do know. No one saw anyone aboard. The boat didn't behave like it was caught in any normal current. And from what old Mrs. Darrow said last night, this isn't something the river does, unless something's off. What could be off?" Someone called from the back. Mrs. Darrow, leaning on her cane, answered softly, "When the river grows quiet, it's listening. And when it's listening, something it has carried some history, some sorrow, some truth starts rising again." Her words filled the room with a hush far deeper than any silence the river could conjure. Everyone knew the river had swallowed tragedies, old accidents, sudden storms, lost travelers, even entire settlements that faded as the currents carved new paths. But the notion that the river remembered these things, that it listened, waited, and spoke felt both comforting and terrifying. That night, as the townspeople settled back into their homes, their curiosity grew sharper. Children asked their parents if the boat would return. Elderly folks claimed they had heard whispers in the river wind, and a few younger men began arguing about whether they should follow the boat's trail downstream. But all of these voices were small compared to the quiet that took over every house once the lamps were blown out. Because the truth was simple. They all felt watched, not by a person, not by a creature, but by the river itself. 3 nights later, the river spoke again, this time not with a drifting boat, but with a strange hum in the water. Those who lived closest to the docks woke to find the river glowing faintly, as though reflecting lantern light when no lanterns burned. Mrs. Darrow felt it first, a vibration in the air that reminded her of stories told to her when she was a girl. Stories of moments when the river remembered something too old for a human memory. By morning, the glow had faded, but the marks had left the impressions in the mud. The disturbed reeds, the faint scent of old wood and smoke suggested that the drifting vessel had come back sometime before dawn. Yet no one had heard it. No one had seen the lantern lights return, and no one knew where the boat had gone next. The people of Willow Bend began to wonder if the riverboat was not merely drifting, but seeking something. Perhaps a place, perhaps a person, perhaps a truth buried beneath decades of forgotten waters. Whispers spread from porch to porch, from diner to church steps. Theories grew wild, but one belief slowly began to unite the town. The river was not angry, only burdened by a story that had never been fully told, a mystery that had never been fully faced. And perhaps the boat, the silent, drifting lantern-lit vessel, was the river's way of carrying that story back into the world. As evening fell once more, the townspeople gathered near the water's edge, not because the boat had returned, but because they felt it might. Families stood together. Children clung to their parents. Older men removed their hats in quiet respect, and Mrs. Darrow, frail but steady, whispered, "Listen, the river speaks to those willing to hear." And the river, calm yet watchful, flowed past, as if preparing to reveal its long-held truth, one whisper, one ripple, one drifting lantern at a time. The river's whisper still trembled in the air, echoing the fear and wonder that had settled over Willow Bend after the drifting boat slipped into darkness again. When the story of the silent vessel reached the old hospital on the hill long abandoned except for its single caretaker, no one expected that the truth would come from a man who had spent years speaking to no one. His name was Elias Moreau, the last surviving passenger of a forgotten voyage, a man who carried memories the river had swallowed but never erased. For decades he had remained hidden away from the world, kept alive only by a stubborn heart and the fragments of a story he could never fully tell. The caretaker, a kind woman named Ruth Callahan, had cared for Elias for years. She knew he woke some nights trembling, whispering things she barely understood, things about lantern lights drifting over dark water, about shouts swallowed by the Mississippi, about a fog that felt alive. But Elias always refused to speak of it in daylight. He claimed the river listened, and if he spoke too clearly, the river might come for him too. Yet the night news of the drifting boat reached him. Something changed. He sat upright in bed, eyes wide, breath sharp and uneven. When Ruth came to calm him, he whispered, "It's back. After all this time, it's come for the rest of the story." His voice, rough with age and fear, carried the same tremor the townspeople had felt when the riverboat passed by Willow Bend. Ruth tried to ask what he meant, but he only shook his head and murmured, "I didn't think it would ever rise again. I hoped the river had forgotten." But the river had not forgotten, and neither had he. That same night, with a strength no one thought possible for a man his age, Elias rose, took his walking stick, and demanded to be taken down to the river. Ruth tried to stop him, but he stared at her with a seriousness that rooted her to the floor. "If I don't speak now," he said, "the river will keep dragging that story up until it destroys someone else." As they reached the riverbank, the water was calm to calm. The lantern-like glow that had appeared 2 nights before flickered faintly along the far curve. Ruth felt a prickle on the back of her neck, as though the river were holding its breath again, waiting. Elias stood at the edge, eyes fixed on the dark current, and for the first time in years he spoke with clarity. "This river remembers everything it takes," he said. "But once in a lifetime, someone remains who remembers what the river tried to hide." Ruth stepped closer. "Elias, what happened that night?" He closed his eyes, and the past rose like a current beneath him. "It was 1871, he began, voice steady. "The Magnolia Dondat was the name of the vessel set out from St. Louis, with 23 passengers and a crew of 9. I was 18 then, traveling with my older brother Silas. I remember the deck full of laughter, the lanterns swaying in the warm night air. No one on board could have imagined how the river would change before dawn." He paused, hands tightening around his walking stick. "The fog came first. Not the kind you see in the mornings. This one was thick, cold, and alive. It crept across the deck until we couldn't see our own hands. The captain tried to steer away from it, but the river wouldn't let us. Every time the crew tried to turn the boat, the current dragged us back. Rude listened it, the hairs on her arms rising. The lantern-like glow on the distant bend flickered again. When the fog swallowed the boat, Elias said, the river grew silent, so silent we could hear the creaking of the planks beneath our feet. And then the voices began." He swallowed hard. "Not human voices, not screams. More like echoes, ghosts of things the river had taken long ago. Lost travelers, drowned workers, stolen boats, forgotten tragedies. Their memories rose around us, touching our skin like cold hands." Ruth felt the ground shift beneath her. Elias continued. "My brother grabbed my arm and told me not to look, but I did." His voice dropped, and what I saw was the river trying to show us something. Not to scare us, to warn us. He drew a shaky breath. We had sailed into a crossing point where old tragedies converged. A place where the river carried decades of sorrow. Too much sorrow. The fog was killing us. It was trying to keep us from seeing what the river had become. But the crew panicked, Elia said. They tried ringing the bells, lighting more lanterns, shouting orders, and that noise woke something in the river. Something ancient. Something tired. Ruth's voice trembled. "What happened to the others?" Elias lifted his eyes to the water, now glowing in small pulses. "They were taken. Not by force, not by violence, but by forgetting. One by one, they stepped into the fog, calling out for help, calling for loved ones, until their voices faded like ripples. It was as if the river absorbed them into its memory. And you," Ruth whispered. Elias touched his chest. "My brother pushed me into a lifeboat before stepping into the fog himself. His last words were, 'Remember what the river won't.' Then the fog closed over him. He wiped a tear with the back of his hand. I drifted for hours until a trading barge found me at dawn. No one believed what I told them. They said I had been dreaming, hallucinating. But I knew, and the river knew." The pulse of lantern-like light shimmered again along the bend closer now. Elias whispered, "The boat isn't haunting us. It's unfinished. It carries all those memories that never found a resting place." Ruth stared at the glow, her breath quickening. "Why come back now?" "Because someone must hear the rest," Elias said. "Someone must finally witness what the river tried to warn us about, the place where it hides its sorrow." Suddenly the light brightened. A shape appeared slow, ghost-like, drifting into view. Ruth gasped. Elias closed his eyes, whispering a name. Silas. The Magnolia Dawn emerged from the darkness without a sound. Lanterns glowing, windows empty, but filled with quiet longing. It stopped directly before Elias, as if recognizing him. He stepped forward. Ruth grabbed his arm. Elias? No. He shook his head gently. I won't vanish. Not this time. I'm not going to join the river's memory. I'm here to release it. A soft wind rose from the water, carrying faint whispers voices from long ago. Voices that had waited for decades to be heard. Elias lifted a trembling hand to the railing of the drifting boat. The river responded. The glow brightened, spreading across the hull, flickering like a story unfolding. For a moment, Ruth saw shadows, faces of passengers, crew members, and finally Silas, standing tall and clear, smiling at Elias with gratitude. Then the lanterns dimmed. The whispers faded. The river exhaled, and the Magnolia Dawn, carrying the memories Elias had finally spoken aloud, drifted peacefully down the bend, its lights softening until they disappeared into the night. Elias stepped back, tears on his cheeks. It remembers no more, he whispered. The river is free. And for the first time in generations, Willow Bend felt the Mississippi breathing again, calm, relieved, and at peace. The river's breath still lingered in the air, softened by the memory Elias had released, as though the Mississippi itself had waited years to exhale its truth. When night returned to Willow Bend, it carried with it a different kind of silence, one that felt heavier, filled with echoes instead of fear. The drifting riverboat had slipped downstream with a calmness that soothed the banks, yet the townspeople sensed that the story was not finished. The river had given them a glimpse, a whisper, but night currents always carried more than a single truth, and on this night, the river seemed ready to reveal the rest. The moon rose, pale and thin, through a veil of clouds, painting the water with silver ripples. The current moved with slow determination, as though guiding something unseen beneath the surface. People gathered on their porches. Unable to rest, each drawn to the river's muted glow. It was as if the Mississippi was preparing to speak again, not through a drifting boat this time, but through the memories buried deep in its currents. A soft vibration trembled through the wooden docks. Samuel Pike, the ferry operator, felt it first. He leaned forward, gripping a post as the water shimmered strangely beneath him. It wasn't the usual movement of current, it was more deliberate, more rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something vast. The river seemed alive in a way he had never felt before. From the bend upstream came a gentle swirl of fog, the kind that carried sound as if it were an echo from another time. The people of Willow Bend held their breath, remembering Elias's tale, remembering the way the river had once swallowed voices and memories whole. Now, however, the fog did not creep with fear. It drifted softly, almost protectively, like a blanket covering a long-buried truth. The first whisper rose from the water like a sigh. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. It was the faint sound of a paddlewheel turning far away, slow and old, as though time had revived a forgotten rhythm. Some of the townsfolk stepped back in alarm. Others stepped forward in awe. And across the river, faint lights swayed, lantern glows caught in mist, much like the ones that had accompanied the Magnolia Dawn. But these lights were dimmer, scattered, blurred by the movement of water and memory. Reverend Claiborne murmured, "The river is opening its ledger." That was what it felt like, Hanold Archive, long hidden beneath layers of silt and story, rising to the surface one page at a time. The fog thickened, and within it shapes began to move, not clear enough to be people, yet too defined to be mere illusions. They drifted and swayed, as though reenacting moments lost to time. The first shape resembled a long flatboat, its outlines blurred but distinct, pulsing with a faint, pale glow. Children peered from behind their parents, their eyes wide. Older townspeople crossed themselves or removed their hats. The boat drifted silently, and with it came the hush of an older era, the era of the first river traders who had vanished in storms no one could explain. Then another shape emerged, taller and narrower, perhaps the shadow of a steam launch that had burned decades ago. Its smokestack flickered like a candle wick. Its deck shimmered with ghostly firelight. No sound came from it. No screams. Only the echo of what once had been. As these silhouettes drifted past, the river seemed to shift again, pulling the town deeper into its memory. The shapes were not real vessels, but memories, pieces of time the river had held on to, now allowed to rise only because the Magnolia Dawn had finally released its burden. The stories of the past were not meant to haunt the living forever, but before fading, they needed to be seen, acknowledged, understood. The fog swirled. The lights shimmered, and then, through the mist came something different. Not a boat, not a shadow, but a sound. A melody, soft, wavering, almost like a lullaby sung across the water. It drifted between the houses, through the willows, above the rippling surface. Samuel Pike's eyes widened. He recognized the tune. "My grandfather used to hum that," he whispered. Said he heard it once from a boat that never docked. Ruth Callahan stepped closer to the water, heart pounding. The melody stirred a memory inside her too, a story her mother told her long ago about a vessel that drifted after the Civil War, carrying musicians who never returned. Their final song, they said, was carried by the river long after their disappearance. Now, that same tune floated across the Mississippi once more. As the melody played, the fog thickened into swirling patterns. Within them, faint images, flickered hands, strumming strings, figures swaying with the rhythm, lanterns glowing in time with the beat. They were not ghosts, not spirits, but memories returning to the surface for one last journey downstream. The townspeople stood frozen, spellbound by the merging of time and river. Nothing threatened them. Nothing frightened them. Instead, the night felt like an old wound healing, each note of the melody stitching pieces together. Then the melody faded, replaced by a softer sound, the gentle lap of water against unseen hulls. The fog thinned, the shadows blurred. One by one, the glowing shapes dissolved back into the current, leaving behind nothing but ripples and starlight. But the river was not done. A deep rumble stirred beneath the surface, more felt than heard. It rolled through the docks, through the trees, through the ground beneath the people's feet. The Mississippi was shifting, turning, releasing something heavy from its depths. The water darkened, then brightened again as silt and memory churned upward, then scattered downstream. From the center of the river, a final shape rose much fainter than the others, but unmistakably the silhouette of the Magnolia Dawn. Not the lantern-lit vessel Elias had faced, but its earliest reflection, its first memory. The town watched as this pale image drifted slowly, gracefully, like the very first time the real boat had ever touched water. It glowed with a soft golden hue, the kind that came not from lanterns, but from remembrance itself. When the image met the bend, where the real boat had last disappeared, it flickered gently, then dissolved into the current like dust carried by wind. The river fell silent, truly silent. Not the tense silence of fear, but a peaceful stillness as though a chapter had closed, as though the Mississippi had finally allowed its oldest secrets to drift freely into time. Samuel Pike lifted his hat and whispered, "It's done. Whatever the river carried, it's let go." Reverend Claiborne nodded. A river's memory can weigh heavy. Tonight, it chose to lighten itself. As the night currents steadied and the moonlight returned to its gentle glow, The people of Willow Bend felt the Mississippi settle into a calmer rhythm. The river no longer seemed burdened, no longer seemed restless. It flowed steady and warm, as though inviting the world to forget the fear and remember only the story. 4 stories, once heard, did not belong to the river anymore. They belonged to the people. And as they turned away from the water, hearts calmer, breaths easier, the Mississippi carried its secrets downstream, finally free, finally at peace, finally ready to let the past drift wherever the night currents chose to take it. The river's calm breath, after releasing its long-held memories, carried a new weight, as though the Mississippi itself was preparing to finally reveal what it had guarded in silence. For more than a century, all of Willow Bend felt the change. The night no longer trembled with whispers or drifting melodies. The fog no longer carried shadows of long-lost vessels. Instead, the river flowed with an unusual clarity, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the moon like a polished mirror. It was the kind of stillness that signaled not an ending, but an unveiling and opening of the final page in a story no one living had ever truly known. The townspeople sensed it before they saw it. A hum vibrated through the water, faint and low, like the far-off sound of chains settling on a dock. Dogs along the riverbank lifted their heads. Lantern flames flickered, though there was no wind. Even the old trees seemed to lean inward, their branches drawn toward the water as if listening. Ruth Callahan felt it too. She stood at the very spot where Elias had faced the Magnolia Dawn the night before. He was resting now, exhausted, but at peace for the first time in years. His story had freed the river to speak again. But Ruth knew the river was not done. Elias had given his memory. Now the river was ready to give its truth. A faint glow spread across the surface, different from lantern light, different from reflected moonlight. It was deeper, rising from beneath, illuminating the water from the inside like a hidden sun. The glow widened until it formed a halo of pale gold, pulsing softly with the river's rhythm. Samuel Pike approached, breath held tight. "Same place as the old cargo path," he muttered. "Same bend. Shame, depth." Root nodded. The glow intensified, and the river's surface began to churn in slow spirals, pulling silt upward in gentle, swirling patterns. It was not violent. It was not fearful. It was deliberate, like hands brushing away dust from something long buried. As the water cleared, shapes emerged below the surface. The townspeople leaned forward. Not ghosts this time. Not visions, but wood. Dark, waterlogged wood, preserved by the cold depths of time. The outline of a hull, the curve of a bow, the broken teeth of a paddlewheel half buried in silt, and near the front, the rotted remains of a captain's cabin, its door hanging open, swaying with the current like it had been waiting for someone to look inside. The Magnolia Dawn's original body, T1 lost in 1871, had risen from the deep. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Children stared with wide eyes. The elders whispered old stories that suddenly felt real. The river, at last, was showing them where everything had ended and where everything had begun. Ruth stepped to the edge, heart pounding as the truth settled like a weight around her. "It's the wreck," she whispered. "The real wreck." Samuel swallowed hard. But why now? Why after all these years? Ruth's voice trembled. Because now, someone finally listened. The golden glow brightened again, spreading across the wreck, revealing details no one expected to see. The carved initials on the railings, the faint outline of the Magnolia Dawn's name still etched into the worn wood, and at the very center of the deck something metallic, glinting faintly. "Look there," Samuel said. The water parted just enough for them to see it clearly. Compass. Its brass casing dulled by time but intact, its needle spinning slowly as though awakening after a long sleep. Something about it, drew Ruth forward. She knelt at the bank, reaching out. The river lifted the compass toward her hand with a gentle swell. When her fingers closed around it, the needle stopped spinning. It pointed upstream, then downstream, then, slowly, it turned to face the ruins of the captain's cabin. Ruth felt a tremor pass through her. "It's showing us something," she whispered. "Sam will know. Maybe showing us who the captain really was." The legends had always said the captain disappeared, that he abandoned his crew, that he fled into the fog and left the boat to drift into eternity. But the river, with its new calmness, seemed ready to correct those stories. The golden light deepened around the cabin's doorway. The water shimmered. Slowly, gently, something floated upward from inside paper, preserved by mud and darkness. It surfaced in the glow, and Ruth lifted it carefully. A journal. Its leather cover cracked, but still holding strong. On the first page, written in a steady hand, were the words, "Captain Silas Moreau, Logbook 1871, Ruth's breath caught. Silas Ilias's brother, the man who had pushed the boy into the lifeboat and vanished into the fog." Samuel spoke softly. "He wasn't the captain in the stories, but he was," Ruth whispered. "He must have been. The river was waiting for someone to find this." She opened the journal. The ink had faded but remained legible, protected by mud like the river had guarded it. The first entries spoke of ordinary days passengers boarding, cargo loaded, weather clear, but later pages grew tense, the handwriting shaking as the days approached the night Elias described. Silas wrote of strange currents, of fog that moved against the wind, of lantern lights that dimmed without reason. He described the crew. "It's a rising fear. The passengers falling silent, the river growing too still." Then Ruth reached the final entry. She read it aloud. "If anyone finds this, know that I did not abandon my men. The river changed this night. It showed us more than any man should see. I am holding the wheel, not to escape, but to guide us through whatever this is. My brother Elias is the only one I can save. The river wants a witness, not a captain. If I do not survive, let the river keep me. But let Elias live to tell the truth." Ruth's voice shook. Silas had never fled. He had never abandoned anyone. He had steered the Magnolia Dawn into the fog on purpose to save a child, to calm a terrified crew, to face whatever the river had become. The townspeople bowed their heads. The Mississippi flowed with a soft, relieved whisper, as though a great misunderstanding had finally been washed away. From the wreck, another faint glow emerged, this time a soft, deep blue. It surrounded the cabin's doorway, then slowly faded, leaving the ruins peaceful and unmoving. The river began to lower the wreck gently, respectfully, allowing it to return to the depths now that its truth had risen. Ruth closed the journal, holding it tightly to her chest. "Elias needs to hear this," she whispered. "He deserves to know who his brother really was. Some well know it. And the river, it deserves to be remembered honestly." The wreck sank fully beneath the surface, leaving only calm water and moonlight behind. The golden glow faded, replaced by the natural shimmer of the Mississippi. The great river had spoken clearly. Finally, and now it rested. As Ruth turned to leave, the current shifted once more, just enough to brush her ankles. She felt a touch like a gentle thank you, a soft acknowledgement that the story had finally reached its rightful end. The truth had surfaced. The captain had been found, and the river silent witness to centuries flowed freely at last. Its burden lifted, its secrets laid to rest, its voice calm as it carried the final pieces of the past downstream, into peace, into memory, into time. The echoes of truth that had risen from the river's depths lingered in the night air as the drifting vessel continued onward, as if history itself urged it forward. The water around the old riverboat glowed faintly under a thin layer of mist, the lantern at its bow flickering like a weary guardian. Trying to stay awake, it had traveled far beyond the banks where people once gathered to whisper theories, fears, and hopes about its strange journey. Now, it cut through the quiet darkness, not in a hurry, not lost, but moved by a purpose that seemed older than the stories it carried. The boat looked abandoned, yet it felt alive though the past had chosen it as the last messenger of something America's waters refused to forget. The gentle pulse of the water echoed softly against the hull, carrying the rhythm of memories that refused to sink beneath the surface. As night deepened, the shadows of the riverbank stretched long and thin, reaching toward the boat as if begging it to stop and explain itself. But the riverboat drifted on with calm determination, its lantern light stretching into eternity like a thin golden thread. It was a strange sight, neither ghostly nor fully real, something suspended between the world that sleeps and the world that remembers. The slow persistence of the boat's journey reflected the slow surfacing of truths long buried. People who once witnessed it from a distance believed that it was driven by spirits or fate. But now the deeper story began unfolding, one that belonged to the land, the water, and the passage of time itself. The riverboat's motion was not the restless wandering of an empty vessel, but the steady continuation of something unfinished. Every creak of its wooden beams sounded like a word forming from the past. Every ripple behind it looked like a trail of stories that had refused to stay forgotten. The weight of those stories grew heavier as the river carried them, yet the boat bore them without complaint, as though it had done so for generations. The moon watched from above us silent, pale witness casting ribbons of light across the water that shimmered like forgotten ink, drying on an old letter. In its glow, the outlines of the boat seemed sharper, more deliberate, revealing the faint carved initials along its rails, the weathered brass fixtures, and the narrow windows through which no face ever appeared. But the emptiness didn't feel cold or hollow. Instead, it felt expectant, as if waiting for someone to finally understand. That same quiet expectation flowed into the next stretch of river, where the current changed subtly, guiding the vessel toward a region known for stories that rarely entered history books. This was land remembered not by official records, but by families whose roots grew deep along the water essay. The river had always been their storyteller, their guardian, their warning bell. They believed that every bend held a memory, every ripple an echo of something once lived. And now, the drifting boat glided past their shores, as though acknowledging their generations of listening. The people of those river towns had long understood that the past never truly disappears, it drifts, it resurfaces, it waits, and the riverboat seemed to embody that understanding perfectly. They remembered tales of the missing captain, whose last voyage ended not in disaster, but in mystery. They remembered the crew who vanished without leaving behind a single lantern extinguished or rope untied. They remembered the passenger whose recollections brought clarity to the fog of rumor. All their voices, once scattered across time, now felt woven into the slow-moving vessel. Their whispers echoed in the air as the riverboat passed the old docks, now worn silver from decades of current and wind. Some believed the boat was guided by unseen hands. Others thought it followed the last command the captain ever gave. But a few elders saw something deeper. A vessel that refused to stop because the story it carried had not yet found its ending. To them, the riverboat was a bridge between centuries, a reminder that the past is only asleep when the river is calm. And tonight, it was not calm at all. The shifting wind carried those unspoken beliefs across the water, gently brushing against the lantern flame. The light flickered, but never went out. It was as if the river itself protected it, refusing to let darkness swallow the final chapter. And so, the lantern's glow remained steady, slicing through fog and pushing shadows aside like a determined historian refusing to let truth stay buried. The boat moved with that same stubborn clarity, an emblem of motion that came not from engines or oars, but from memory itself. That memory pulsed again as the river widened, opening into a stretch where old battles had once been fought. Trade routes had thrived, and generations had shaped futures unknowingly linked to the drifting vessel. The boat seemed to acknowledge these histories, slowing slightly as if bowing its head to the stories that preceded it. The night air smelled of iron and pine, the scent of places where time has never fully chosen a side between past and present. Here, the riverboat felt almost reverent, as though honoring every life whose footsteps had echoed along this shoreline. The reverence softened into something gentler, a sense of peace, perhaps even forgiveness as the river guided the vessel forward. Peace had always followed this boat, even when the truth surrounding it was fraught with fear or sorrow. Perhaps it drifted not to remind people of the tragedy of the vanished crew, but to show that history, no matter how heavy, could still move with grace. Perhaps the boat's long voyage was an act of healing, a way for the river to say that nothing truly ends on its waters, not even unanswered questions. That gentle understanding deepened as midnight approached. The stars brightened overhead, reflecting on the water like scattered pieces of an old, broken compass, guiding the story home. The riverboat floated steadily beneath them, the lantern light shimmering in perfect harmony with the sky. It looked, for a moment, like time itself had folded around the vessel, holding it safely between what was and what would be. The boat was more than wood, metal, and stories. It was a quiet, persistent act of remembrance. And so the night carried it deeper into the heart of the unknown, where the river wound through untouched wilderness, and the current moved with a rhythm older than any map. Yet the boat never faltered. Its path was unwavering, its presence peaceful, its purpose unmistakable. Every mile it traveled whispered the same message: that history does not sleep when there is still something left to be understood. The understanding finally revealed itself, not as a single revelation, but as a feeling that settled deep within the river's flow. The boat moved not to escape the past, but to keep it alive, not to outrun truth, but to protect it, not to deliver answers, but to remind those who saw it that stories are part of the land, the water, and the hearts of people who choose to remember. The riverboat that kept moving, so history would not sleep, drifted onward, lantern glowing softly like a promise made to the night. It did not need a captain or a crew. It had the river, it, at, memory, and as long as both remained, the boat would continue its journey slow, steady, unending, carrying the weight of America's forgotten waters into every new dawn.